Thank you, Lonnie. And next time I want you to have something on your back so that you can add another instrument to the mix, and a drum, something. I don't know. We have been homeschooling for years, but Nathan, our oldest, when he started, like with kindergarten and first grade, he was in public school, went to Sternberger. And how that worked is that I would take him to school, and then when school was out, Caroline would go and pick him up. And when he was in kindergarten, it was early in the year, and it was still warm outside, and Caroline goes to pick him up. And I'm here at the church, but I get a call from her as she is in the car line, and she said the van is dead. And so I get in my car and I head over there, and am anticipating that somehow she just needs to be jumped off. I've got some battery jumper cables in my trunk, and I'll help her get going. And so, long story, what actually occurred though is that she had gotten into car line early and was just kind of waiting in line. And she had the key turned to the AC position so that you can listen to the radio. She's listening to the radio, but it's late August, it's early September, it's still hot outside, and so she decides she's kind of hot, so she rolls the windows up and turns it one more notch to turn the air conditioner on, but not turning the engine on. So all that is just sitting there, she's nice and comfortable off the battery. And so then when it comes time to actually start the car, well, she's used all that power to stay comfortable. And so now the car is dead in the car line. And I get over there, and car line is still going on. And I don't know if you are aware of this, but when you're jumping cars off, you can't come up behind them. You need to be facing them. So what do I need to do? I need to go the opposite direction in the car line. There's a reason that mamas are referred to as mama bears. And so I've got all of these mothers that see me and watch this little white Accord head in the opposite direction. At that point, I realized that one of my spiritual gifts is mind reading. And I could see that they hated me. And you could see on their faces, what is the matter with you? And so like they're doubly aggravated because they got Caroline who's sitting there like stranded in the car line, and so that's slowing things down. And then you got me headed in the opposite direction to try to get in front of her so that I can jump this car off. And I didn't attempt to read their lips. I'm sure they weren't whispering a blessing to me, but the reality is this: they were not at all pleased with me. And they were not, because I was headed in the opposite direction. I was headed in the opposite direction to them, and they didn't like it. Hopefully you realize that if you're a person that has a relationship with Christ and you even remotely seek to take that seriously, that is kind of a picture of how you're operating in this culture. Because we're in a world, we're in an environment that is not headed towards God, but they're headed away from Him. And if you're trying to follow Jesus and to follow what God has said in His Word, you are very much living in a countercultural way. And you're going to, the more that you take your commitment to the Lord and living out His standards, the more that you take that seriously, the more it is that you're going to be experiencing opposition and pushback. Now, that's just reality. But it's also reality that that's nothing new. It has always been the case that the people of God have experienced pushback for their commitment to the Lord, because as you seek to live for Him, you are going to be living counterculturally. And so you're going to be getting opposition. You're going to be getting some stares. You're going to be getting some persecution in minimal forms, or sometimes in some significant forms. That's nothing new. But the reality is this: it is not something that you can and will experience, but it is something that you can experience and you can thrive in. That God can use your experience in hostile territory in ways that have a meaningful, consequential, eternal impact in the lives of others. That's what we're going to be thinking about in a new series that starts today that we're calling Life in Babylon. We're going to be looking at the example of Daniel, who was living in Babylon in hostile territory. And it wasn't simply that he lived there, but he was able to be used by God to thrive there, and to be used by God even in an environment that was very much anti-God, to demonstrate the difference that knowing and following the Lord can actually make. So here's the question we want to think about today. As someone who is a follower of Christ, if that's true of you, you are living counterculturally. You are called to live standards that are opposed to the culture. So here's this. How do I express the convictions, the standards that He has put out there for me? How do I express these convictions that are countercultural? There's a stack of ways that we can do so. Some are helpful, some are not so helpful. So looking at the example of Daniel, how can we express convictions that are countercultural? Look with me in your Bibles today to the first chapter of that book, Daniel chapter 1. And we're going to actually look at the bulk of the first chapter. We're not going to read its entirety at this point, but if you would just leave your Bibles open. But join me in Daniel chapter 1, where we're told this in verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Jehoiakim of Judah, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon came to Jerusalem and laid siege to it. The Lord handed Jehoiakim of Judah over to him along with some of the vessels from the house of God. Nebuchadnezzar carried them to the land of Babylon, to the house of his God, and put the vessels in the treasury of his God. The king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men without any physical defect, good-looking, suitable for instruction in all wisdom, knowledgeable, perceptive, and capable of serving in the king's palace. He was to teach them the Chaldean, that's the Babylonian language, and literature. The king assigned them daily provisions from the royal food and from the wine that he drank. They were to be trained for 3 years, and at the end of that time, they were to attend the king. Among them, from the Judites, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief eunuch gave them names. He gave the name Belteshazzar to Daniel, Shadrach to Hananiah, Meshach to Mishael, and Abednego to Azariah. But Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or the wine he drank, so he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. All right, so we're going to get more of this story here in just a moment, but what we are observing here is someone who has a relationship with the Lord, who is taking that commitment to God seriously, and they have convictions as guided by the Lord that are opposed to the environment in which they're working in, opposed to the environment in which they are living in. Hopefully that sounds familiar. And so hopefully you can see that if we pay attention to an example of Daniel here, it helps answer the question for us. How is it that I can express these countercultural convictions? How can I live those out? How can I communicate those to others? The first thing that you need to do is this. I need to be respectfully clear. I need to be respectfully clear. Now, if you go back to verse 1, this actually gives us some information, or those that are smarter than us, some information to be able to date what we're reading here. It takes us to about 605 BC. Some of you might remember a little bit of that. But anyway, 605 BC, and at this point, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar is the king of Babylon, and we're mentioned about the king of Judah. Now, Judah, if you remember, the people of God are divided, and there's the north and the south. 2 tribes in the north, that's Israel. 10 tribes in the south, that's Judah. Israel, at this point, the tribes in the north, they have already fallen. So Israel as a nation no longer exists. But the Hebrews, the people of God, and Judah are still around. But the Babylonians come in under Nebuchadnezzar's reign, and they lay siege to Jerusalem. So they surround it, and they start tightening the grip that they have on the city, limiting what could or what can't come in or go out. And so finally what happens is that they're able to capture Jerusalem. Judah doesn't completely fall at this point, but at least Nebuchadnezzar gets the city, or significant portions of it. And if you are going to be a nation, a king, and you're going to wage war against anyone else, one of the reasons that you may do so is this: you want to get their stuff. And Nebuchadnezzar relished the thought of getting the stuff of the people of Judah, specifically of the city of Jerusalem. And so he did get some of their stuff. He got, we're told here, some of the vessels from the temple. I mean, anything that was really special or really nice in terms of monetary value, that stuff was in the temple. And so that's going to be a place where Nebuchadnezzar is going to send his soldiers to raid, so that they take as much as they possibly can of that stuff, and that's carted off to Babylon. But they don't just take material stuff, they also take people, because there are people that could be of help to them. And we're told that he gave his chief eunuch, so that's like his chief of staff, I guess. So this is the guy that he's going to pass orders off to, bring back some of the choicest men from Babylon. from Judah and bring them back to Babylon. And so bring people that are that are cultured. I mean, that are I don't know, that first of all, he wants people that are guys that are handsome. We're told that they should be without any physical defect, so they should be in good physical condition. They'll be suitable for instruction and all wisdom, so they don't pick the dumb clucks. I mean, pick somebody that's capable of learning, and they should be perceptive and capable of serving in the king's palace. So look out and see if you see some people that you think, oh, that's somebody that looks kind of like they could do work and service in the king's palace. And let's bring them back. And we're not just going to bring them back and put them to work, but we're going to bring them back, and we're going to work on them. We're going to train them. We're essentially going to send them to Babylonian boot camp, and we're going to impart to them everything that's involved in living out Babylonian culture. So we're going to read to them, and they're going to learn our language, and they're going to read some of our classic books, and they're going to come to understand us as a people. And beyond that, we're actually going to give them Babylonian names. So they've got these Hebrew names, and we're going to change their names. I don't know why it is the case, and if you're familiar at all with the stories of Daniel, you know not only Daniel, but you know Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I don't know why we follow their Babylonian names. We just do. But Daniel, we hold on to his Hebrew name. Anyway, so we're going to give them new names. We're going to teach them. We're going to train them. We're going to teach them a new language. We're going to expose them to this literature. We're going to do all of these things. Why? Because we want to make them operate like us. So we're going to take these people who aren't like us, who are headed in a different direction, and what do we want to do? We want to assimilate them. We want to culture them so that they operate like us. Now, does that sound familiar? Sure it is. Now, if you're somebody that has a relationship with God, you are operating in a culture where the culture is seeking to do that. And whether it's in media, whether it is in academia, whether it is in social media, in so many different avenues, the culture in which we are seeking to operate wants to lead us, to prompt us, to shape us, to mold us so that we're headed in the same direction that they are. But if you have a relationship with Christ, if you are following Jesus, you can't be following culture. If you're following God, you can't be following the crowd. And so here, among the things that we know about Daniel are these. We know something about his name. We know that he's a Hebrew, but it's also abundantly clear that Daniel is a guy who has a relationship with God, and he takes that seriously. That this is not something about which he's just kind of like, eh. And as this book begins to unfold, you can see consistently just how serious it is. He takes his commitment to the Lord. Now, so by the time you get to verse 8, we're told that Daniel determined he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So among the things that these guys are getting, you got all these Hebrews that have been carted off from Jerusalem. They're at Babylonian boot camp. And in the scheme of things, I mean, they're getting treated pretty well. I mean, they're getting classic training in Babylonian literature, learning the language. They're going to be living in pretty royal, regal conditions. They're going to be eating the same food that the king eats. And so it's not like they're not going to K&W. I mean, they're eating king's food here, all right? So Daniel, we're told in verse 8, he determined he was not going to defile himself with that food or with that drink. Now, all we know for certain is what we just read. That's all we know. And so what the specifics were, we're unsure of, but we can speculate. And so there's a couple of things that are possible. One is that this is food that Daniel knew had been first consecrated or dedicated to some Babylonian pagan god. And that maybe they had made a big to-do about this and even had these worship services where all the food and drink that the king and those that around him would be eating, that they would have made a big to-do about the fact, hey, we've first rendered this and offered this to the great God, blah, 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 blah. It could be that it was that. Or it could be that this was stuff that was out of bounds according to standards that God had given going back as far as Moses. So it didn't meet the dietary restrictions that God had earlier given. Maybe there's something else. We just don't know. All it is that we do know is this. Daniel was certain that this food and this drink he should not have because of his commitment to the Lord. Somehow the Spirit of God has demonstrated and communicated to him this is out of bounds. And he knows that to take part in this is not inconsequential, and that's why he uses the word defile. So this is going to have spiritual consequence for him, and so he's decided, here in this environment, I've got people that are trying to impose this culture and these standards on me, but I've got the Spirit of God guiding me in a different direction, so what do I do? And so what he does is that he communicates that conviction, and he does so in two ways. He does so in ways that are respectful. He does so in ways that are clear. And so as he communicates that this is, as he communicates with clarity here, he says, I'm not going to defile myself, or he goes to the chief eunuch, so to the king's, essentially his chief of staff, and he says, hey, he asks for permission to not defile himself. Now, in communicating the fact that he was defiling himself, that's communicating this idea that this was a standard that God had given, that God had impressed on him, and he was, by using words like that, he was seeking to be very clear. He was not trying to minimize. He was not trying to hide. He was not trying to obfuscate the conviction that he had. Now, let me give you an example, though. When I was, certainly by the time I was in ninth grade, I felt like God was beginning to put a burden on my heart about serving him as a preacher. I just began to feel that way. I wasn't for sure, but I felt like he was beginning to impress me in that way. And when I was in ninth grade was still in, at that point in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, it was in junior high school. And there was a class that everybody in ninth grade had to take. It was called Decisions for High School. And so leading you to think about some of the choices academically that you're going to be making, starting to get you to think about what's going to happen after high school. Are you going to go to college? Are you going to go to work? What are you going to do? Anyway, one of the things that we had to do during that class was to investigate 3 careers that we might be interested in, and do some sort of research project on them, and then you would write something about it. The reality is, at this point, even as a ninth grader, I felt like what God was wanting me to do was to serve him doing what I'm doing now. And so that's what I really felt like God was guiding me to do. But I was also aware of this. As a ninth grader, saying that you feel like God wants you to be a preacher, it's not considered to be particularly cool, right? And so I thought, well, I don't know exactly what I want to do. I'd like to learn more about what's part of that. I'd like to start thinking about preparing towards that direction, but I don't want anybody to know that I might actually be thinking about being a preacher. So what can I do? And so I decided I'll make a joke out of this. So since we had to pick 3 careers, I don't remember what the third one was, but the other thing that I picked, so I did clergy, some other thing, and then I did podiatrist. So let's face it, who really wants to be a foot doctor? I mean, thank God for them, but how do you wind up saying, man, I'd like to look at people's feet? We're not talking about like cute baby feet. We're talking about those ones, that some of your toenails with the angle grinder and all that stuff, trying to cut through those bad boys. Words like bunion, corn, and I don't mean cream. And so podiatrists, they're not just dealing with feet, they're dealing with the bad ones. I don't know. I don't know why anybody wants to deal with that. And so I thought, this is my perspective, if I can sneak this in with these other things, then nobody will be the wiser. And so I can kind of operate under the radar. And so I can kind of do this whole, what God may be showing me, but I'll keep it on the down low and not draw any attention. I don't say that to celebrate this. I don't say that as a badge of honor. I'm saying that I was doing that, trying to stay under the radar. And one of the things that I was not doing is this. I was not being clear. I was trying to lurk behind stuff. Here you see Daniel not doing that. He is being very clear, this is what I believe that God has called me to, and if I stay on this path doing what you've asked, spiritually speaking, I'm going to be defiling myself. And so he's very clear about that. But he's not only just clear in communicating that, it's also the case that he is respectful. He is respectful as he communicates this. Pay attention not simply to what he says, but what he doesn't say. It says he asks permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. And just the whole excuse me, the act of asking permission was demonstrating respect for the authority that he was operating under. But Daniel doesn't say stuff like this: I am not eating them devil biscuits. You and your little pagan pastries, not having it. This infidel food that you guys are eating, I'm not having anything to do with that, you nasty bunch of pagans. Not eating your junk. Not having anything to do with this. He doesn't do that at all. He's clear about the fact that there is a conviction here, there is a line that seems to be impressed on his heart by God that he is not, and is asking, please don't have me to cross that. But he's doing so not wagging his finger at them and waving his fist at them. He's acting respectful towards them. Pay attention to what he's doing here. It is possible that the chief eunuch could be offended by this. But how Daniel operates is that he puts the weight on his conviction to God, not his opposition to people. Let me say that again. He puts the weight of the statement on his conviction to God, not on his opposition to people. This very easily ensnares us today. We are operating in a very antagonistic culture where people love to stick it to people, whether it's talking heads on cable or it's on social media, it's on Facebook, it's on Instagram, it's on Twitter, and just being nasty to people. And unfortunately, too many times people that are on our team, people that are followers of Jesus, too many times we lose sight of the fact that living for Jesus doesn't mean that we're opposed to people. Living for Jesus means that we're for Jesus. That doesn't lead us to be against people. As he communicates, this is the standard that God has called me to, he's not saying you bunch of nasty cretins. He's saying the weight is on his commitment to God, not his opposition to people. So I would say this: Daniel was clear, but he was respectful in expressing his convictions that were countercultural. There's something else that Daniel did that we need to do, and that's this: be prepared to face the consequences. You need to be prepared to face the consequences. So Daniel has been operating in such a way where we're told in verse 9, God had granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. So he's been operating in a way where, even though, that Daniel was part of the people that had been the enemy, I kind of like Daniel. Daniel's a nice guy. There's people I'm sure that you have ideological differences with, but you're like, I still like them as a person. But that's how Daniel's operating. He's operating as a likable, respectful, courteous person. And so he says to Daniel, listen, I fear my lord the king who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your face is looking thinner than the other men, young men in age? You would endanger my life with the king. Let me just tell you, Daniel, you are part of the king's property. And the king wants his property, including his people, all of his stuff, he wants to be taken care of properly. And so if you're saying, hey, don't let me eat this stuff, what am I going to do if you show up looking gaunt, emaciated? It's all the stuff that people call me. Skinny. If you show up looking like that, the king is going to be ticked because you're his property, and he has allowed, not just allowed, but he's given instructions that the king's provisions, and you got the king's food is going to be the best. That's what he wants you guys to eat. And if you're saying, I don't want to eat that, and you come in here looking haggard and lean and skinny and lanky and all that stuff, that's going to be a problem. It's going to put my head on the line. So Daniel asked the question. Verse 12, it says, he said, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. So what he's doing is this. He is willing, and not willing, but he's active in choosing to say, this is what God has called me to. Here's the line, and I'm going to step up to it. And as I stand for those convictions, the chips are going to fall wherever they may. And it may cause me blessing, it may cause me adverse consequence, but regardless, following God has consequences, and Daniel's decided, I'm going to pay those, whatever they are. Now, what happens? we're told at the end of 10 days, they looked better and healthier than all the young men who were eating the king's food. So they've just been eating water and vegetables, right? And probably not the good fried ones, right? Probably like the steamed ones, raw ones. So it's been water and vegetables. They've been eating like prisoners for days. Everybody else has been eating all this rich, wonderful, delicious, fancy food. And after 10 days, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these four look better. They look better than the other ones. In fact, they look so good. Verse 16, you got to think the rest of they're ticked about this. It says, so the guard continued to remove their food and the wine they drank, they took all the king's food from everybody else, so that everybody now is starting to eat vegetables and water. Daniel realized that there was a line that God had called him to, and he goes up to that line and he says, here I am. Like Martin Luther, here I am, I can do no other. Here I stand, I can do no other. And it may bring blessings, it may bring discomfort, whatever it is. As a follower of God, living in a culture that's headed in the opposite direction, I need to be prepared to face the consequences, whatever it is that they are. Some of you might have seen the current version or maybe the older version of the show. Some of you maybe just saw the older version, but let's make a deal. Remember that Monty Hall back in the day? He was the host of it. I forget the guy's name now that's the host. Wayne Brady. Wayne Brady is the current host. Monty Hall was my guy. How that show moved, if you've ever, I think Game Show Network, you might be able to find some of the old episodes. But if you're not familiar with the show, how it works is you've got this audience, and they pull people from the audience, and they're going to play some sort of game. And as they play this game, they're going to be given some options. And so if you get this right, you can choose what's behind door number 1, door number 2, or what's under the box. What do you want? Well, it could be something really awesome, but you don't know. And so you pick whatever it is that it's going to be. And so your prize, it could be a car. It could be a set of furniture. It could be a new TV. It could be something like that. Or it could be a zonk. And so it could be a billy goat standing in a kiddie pool, right? And so you have no idea what it's going to be. It could be thousands of dollars, or it could be something that's absolutely worthless. You have no idea. Anyway, so throughout the show, you've got people that are winning stuff, and they've got some prizes. And then when it gets to the end of the show, there's the grand prize of the day. And at that point, what they do is they take the two top individuals who won the biggest dollar prizes, and they say, hey, would you like to risk what you have for an opportunity to win the grand prize of the day that's worth $46,373? Because you could risk that and win this, or you could risk what you've got and go home with a billy goat. Or what some of you call being married. I don't know. So you can risk this and maybe get this, or you could risk this and maybe get that. It could go really good. It could go really bad. And plenty of times you'll see people say this, no, I'm just going to keep what I've got. And what are they saying? I just want to play it safe. I don't want to, I really like this set of furniture. We need a new couch and love seats, so I'm really glad to have that. I don't want to risk losing that. I don't want to risk losing this car to get this. I really want to go on that trip. I don't want to risk losing. So I'm just going to play it safe, and I'm just going to step over here. And so I'm not going to gain anything. I'm not going to lose anything. Here's the thing. We're not told about some people in this chapter, except at the beginning. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are 4 Hebrews that are carted off from Jerusalem to Babylon. We know that. We know, it seems abundantly clear, there are other Hebrews that are carted off from Babylon. The only ones that we know anything about in this passage are Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why? Because it seems that these 4 decided, this is the standard that God has called us to, and we're going to take our stand. We're going to risk blessing. We're going to risk adverse consequence. But we're going to be prepared to face it regardless. But it seems that there were other Hebrews who decided what? I'm just going to play it safe. In fact, I like biscuits and gravy. I like those. I like that fudge that they've been serving over there in the King's cafeteria. And so I'm just going to kind of I'm going to kind of keep what I've got. I'm not going to risk anything. Because though it could go good, it could go bad. So I'm going to stay over here. I'm just going to kind of lurk in the shadows. Can we be honest and say that too many times that's what the followers of Jesus are doing in this culture? That we're just lurking, trying to stay lurking in the shadows, being quiet, hoping to garner and attract no attention, just play it safe because we don't want to risk anything. But here's the reality. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they go to the line and say, this is where we are. Please do not lead us. Do not force us to violate this conviction, because doing so, this violates a standard that God has called us to. We're not opposed to you, but we're just committed to Him. And by doing so, what happened? They were able to demonstrate to this guy that doesn't know God that doing stuff God's way is what? It's actually better. It's not just another way. It's not just a different way. It is the best way. And how were Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego able to communicate that? Because they decided, we're going to face the consequences. Whether it brings blessing, whether it brings adversity, we're going to demonstrate what it looks like to do things God's way. And what happened? God was able to use it to great effect. Daniel was operating. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were operating not in friendly territory, but in culture that was headed in the opposite direction. That should sound very familiar to you if you've got a relationship with the Lord. And you can lurk in the shadows, you can duck and run. But that's not what God's called us to. He's called us to live out in opposition. But as we do so, we need to make sure that we are communicating those convictions clearly yet respectfully, prepared to face the consequences, whether it brings blessing, whether it brings difficulty, because that's what He's called us to. That's what He's called you to. Will you bow your heads with me?